In 2016, the internet was abuzz with interviews from U.S. military personnel detailing their encounter with a 13-foot giant in the wilderness of Afghanistan. According to one military contractor, in 2002, the U.S. Special Forces encountered and killed a giant after suffering one casualty to the cryptid spear. The story went around the world and back again, with theories bolstered by a mixture of fiction and facts. The official government response consisted of one statement claiming that they have no records of such an event or any giant men being slain by their forces in Afghanistan or anywhere else. But what really happened in 2002 to the U.S. military? In the year immediately following the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in what it called Operation Enduring Freedom. It wouldn't take long for the event to become known as the War in Afghanistan, which lasted until 2021 and was one of the primary campaigns in America's War on Terror. This explains the widespread presence of the U.S. military on Afghan soil. According to one interview in 2002, a few U.S. soldiers disappeared during a patrol in Kandahar, a remote region of southern Afghanistan. The story told in the interview and then repeated by other sources goes as follows. The U.S. Army HQ sent a group of Special Forces, U.S. Navy SEALs in particular, to investigate the sudden end of radio contact. While the small unit investigated the disappearance, they found a cave in the mountain strewn with military equipment but no soldiers or their remains in sight. The scene suggested the unit was ambushed by someone or thing and either fell down the steep drop or were trapped in the cave. However, the lack of initial request for aerial backup, which was the standard for the U.S. military, was odd and inexplicable. And then something came out of the cave, and it wasn't entirely human. According to the report from one of the soldiers, the creature was a humanoid red-head giant, between 12 and 15 feet tall, with 6 fingers on each hand and presumably 6 toes on each foot. Before they could take aim, one of the soldiers rushed the creature, which would be a deadly mistake. The giant impaled the foolhardy soldier with a spear. The remaining soldiers opened fire and killed the giant after what was reported to be close to 30 seconds of continuous firing. Now bear in mind that it usually doesn't take more than a second or two for a person to get shredded by bullets from an entire squad. The soldiers immediately called for a medevac, which was a Chinook helicopter, and the giant was scooped up and transported away. Then all involved parties signed an NDA to never reveal any details about what happened in the Kandahar Mountains. But that changed in 2016 when some of the soldiers broke their NDA because the world deserved to know the truth. And that's pretty much the extent of the video from 2016. The short film made by author and filmmaker L.A. Marzulli, a self-proclaimed expert on cryptids and the supernatural, used 2 interviews with soldiers who were involved or knew of the event that transpired in 2002. Immediately, theories started to materialize about the Giant of Kandahar. According to Marzulli, the giant's appearance nicely aligns with the biblical interpretation of the Nephilim, commonly seen as giants. According to Marzulli's show, the eyewitness account in the interview identified the giant's weapon as a large pike or spear. Marzulli produced a chunk of bronze that he claimed aligned with the biblical interpretation of a spear that would weigh 300 shekels, or 7.5 pounds. The eyewitness seemed to agree that this could align with the weapon the supposed giant used to kill the U.S. soldier. Marzulli tied this account to other archaeological evidence that could be interpreted to indicate the presence of a race of giants between 12 and 18 feet tall, which was the main subject of his series, The Watchers, where the interview was presented. Shortly after the video aired in August 2016, forum boards and websites focusing on biblical and cryptid sightings buzzed with activity. Many interested parties proposed theories about the giant's identity and whether more could be found in Afghanistan. This led to a widespread notion that the U.S. government was hiding critical information to help uncover the event's truth. In the same month, Snopes, one of the major websites focusing on debunking or confirming internet myths, contacted the Department of Defense to investigate. The spokesperson for the department claimed that they have no record or information about a Special Forces member being killed by a giant in Kandahar. Naturally, the cryptid boards weren't convinced. The government statement was interpreted as an attempt to cover up the truth. At the same time, Marzulli told right-wing news outlets that the government was hiding something that the world had to know right now. In doing so, he only further ingratiated himself with his viewers and followers, who were now fully convinced that the Giant of Kandahar was an entirely historical event cleanly hidden from view. Only now, cracks were forming to reveal the truth beneath. Snopes went further into their investigation based on the little palpable clues in the story. One of the most significant details was that the giant killed a Special Forces member who was referred to as Dan. So Snopes checked the U.S. Army records for deaths in 2002, narrowing down the search to soldiers named Dan or Daniel, which yielded only one result: Sergeant First Class Daniel A. Romero. According to the official report, Romero was killed in April 2002 during a mission to dispose of bombs and other explosive ordnance near Kandahar. The U.S. Army ruled that the death was purely accidental and didn't involve any foul play or supernatural intervention. News outlets covered the story, and the number of casualties in the event was 4, including Daniel, which doesn't match the story presented in the interview. Furthermore, Snopes couldn't find any reports of an entire patrol squad missing in the U.S. Army records, which would have likely been publicly posted and verified. Besides, the story's entire premise reads much like fiction, especially when you consider that the story doesn't even resolve based on the premise it set out. The main interviewer never suggested what happened to the troop or if the U.S. Army HQ initiated further investigations to locate the missing patrol. As such, it's safe to say that there was no missing patrol in the first place, meaning it's highly likely the story was fictional from the beginning. To boot, all the other viable sources on the matter relating to the Giant of Kandahar were practically circular or non-existent. They all go back to the now-deleted YouTube video containing the interview. A reproduction of the video contained no new information, and the trail of clues, as thin as it already was, ended there. Ultimately, the Giant of Kandahar story was probably entirely fabricated by Marzulli to spark interest in his work and gain more popularity or prestige among conspiracy theorists. So what really happened to the US military if they didn't encounter a giant? In 2002, the Afghan war was in full effect, with skirmishes happening regularly. It was most likely the story, if it existed among the military in the first place, was a way for senior members to stave off tension or even haze newer members. According to Marzulli, the second interviewee claimed that by 2005, the US HQ required soldiers to carry weapons which they could aim above an average human's height. This could offer a potential explanation. Since Kandahar is a mountainous region, ambushes would likely happen from higher terrain. The year 2002 saw the death of 17 soldiers due to hostile action across all branches of the U.S. Army, according to the Defense Casualty Analysis System. It's highly probable that some of the deaths in Afghanistan were construed as coming from a supernatural source by the soldiers themselves, perhaps in an effort to minimize the threat that the U.S. enemy posed at the time. Simultaneously, the story would likely profoundly affect troop psychology, keeping them more alert on missions. Alternatively, there's a straightforward answer that the giant was, in fact, just a person of above average height. However, even if that was the case, the theory quickly fell apart because it didn't conform to the rest of the details presented by so-called eyewitnesses and retellers. Then there's also the fact that the subject of Nephilim itself has various depictions that Marzulli failed to take into account. Also called Rephaim, the Nephilim were mentioned in the book of Genesis as the result of reproduction between sons of God and daughters of Adam, or rather divine beings and human women. Various translations of the Bible use the term Nephilim, originally Hebrew Nephilim, to mean giant or fallen, giving the beings the epithet fallen ones. In most of the books that make up the Bible, the role of these giants is to die at the hands of humans who were God's chosen. This was perhaps evocative of the fight between the underdog and the oppressive force that stood against the nation of Israel. It wouldn't take long before the myth of the Nephilim would be equated and merged with other popular myths across cultures, regions, and even eras. In the Greek translation of biblical texts, the Hebrew word Nephilim has been translated and equated with Greek gigantes, which referred to as the giants of their own separate myths. In Greek mythology, giants were considered to be born in Gaia, the earth, when the titan Kronos castrated the tyrannical sky god Uranus. However, most interpretations of the Greek giants don't refer to them being larger than the average human, but refer to giants as being of excessive aggression and strength. In fact, the Greek titans, which were traditionally considered an earlier generation of superhuman beings, would more aptly be regarded as the analog to the Nephilim. Even the Greek translation doesn't always translate Nephilim as gigantes. The word passes into the transcript in a few passages with its stricter translation of fallen. This would equate the translation with the Bible's original interpretation of the Nephilim being somewhere between divinity and the mortals, arousing fascination with the book's contemporary readers. In the end, the similarities between the biblical race of the Nephilim and the Greek giants would be more grounded in a cultural and spiritual sense than dimensions. Both imply that the beings have descended from the religious version of a heavenly domain and were subsequently trapped in the underworld analogs. However, by that time, the damage was done. The Greek translation was used as the basis for medieval translations of the Bible that spread across Europe, and in doing so, the word gigantes got translated into physically large and influenced Nephilim's more modern artistic interpretations. Perhaps the most common story involving giants could be found in the legendary myth of David and Goliath, where the latter is described as a Philistine giant, While the Philistines were analyzed and identified as a group of ancient people who lived in the southern parts of modern-day Israel, Goliath's appearance as a giant can be disputed to mean a person of above-average proportions. The reason is the most common descriptions found in transliterated texts don't align with the common descriptions of Nephilim. This could be a more plausible explanation of what transpired in 2002, just a group of soldiers who killed a raving tall man in a cave. However, that wouldn't have made an interesting story and would likely not have been published by news outlets. Tellingly, this kind of story taps into humanity's fascination with the unknown, perhaps in an attempt to minimize the emotional and psychological toll of traumatic events or uncertainty. For example, one study showcased that classical myths still prevail in shaping the human experience long after the civilizations that created the myth no longer exist. According to anthropologists, these myths are imaginative patterns, networks of powerful symbols that suggest particular ways of interpreting the world. The myth's narrative structure depends on the situation and how the culture that created it coped with its environment. To use the giant of Kandahar as an example, the original myth likely is based on the mythical depiction of the story, David and Goliath. It's possible, therefore, that the soldiers who created and populated said myth were putting themselves in the shoes of the Navy SEALs who defeated the giant. However, the giant itself stands for their entire environment. If we take a slight step back, the story begins with a sudden disappearance. The patrolling squad, a unit that's supposed to be defensive or protective, loses contact with the rest of the U.S. Army. It wouldn't take many leaps of the imagination to see the resemblance of the events that started the War on Terror. Specifically, we're talking about 9/11. The analogy is relatively simple. The disappearance of the squad represents the fall of the Twin Towers. Even though it might seem preposterous to equate the two, the similarities can be broken down. The Twin Towers represented the American standard. To an outsider, they might have only been hunks of stone, metal, and glass that equated to a large target. However, if you go beyond that, the towers represented American supremacy as an economic and perhaps more importantly military superpower of the modern world. That status was what many countries wanted to have or to take from America. By making the towers their target, Al-Qaeda ensured that the spotlight was on them, and they made their purpose as an enemy of American culture and values known to the world. In a way, the fall of the Twin Towers represents the same initial shock experienced by the soldiers in the story of the Giant of Kandahar. The destruction of the World Trade Center immediately shook the core of a country that was considered impervious to outside forces, and the event was entirely out of the scope of imagination or even reason. The same mindset applied to the initial disappearance of the patrol squad as something without seemingly cause or explanation. Then both stories unfold to create a narrative of uncertainty. In the case of the myth, special forces were dispatched to potentially dangerous terrain to investigate the unknown. In reality, the War on Terror brought the U.S. Army to Afghanistan, where soldiers were dropped onto hostile ground with no way of knowing how events would unfold. There can be some debate as to what the giant represents in real life. However, it's pretty clear that it's the analog of terrorists in one way or another. The soldier who died during his fight with a giant is likely representative of the American soldiers who lost their lives in Afghanistan. Just like Dan, who's killed at the hands of the giant, an enemy that came out of the cave and was beyond comprehension, the soldiers saw their potential deaths to terrorists in a similar way. You have to remember, the war in Afghanistan was a war of attrition with an enemy who was in its native element, using hostile terrain against the U.S. Army. To a soldier, this could have translated into opposing forces coming out of the darkness to ambush them. In fact, ambushes were pretty common over the entire length of the war, due to their universal presence as guerrilla tactics that leveraged terrain to their advantage. The Center for Strategic and International Studies suggested that up until 2019, roughly 10% of U.S. Army casualties occurred outside of offensive combat operations. These include ambushes, snipers, and roadside bombs. In a sense, they represent the hidden danger that surrounds the soldiers at every step. Therefore, the fight of the soldiers against the Kandahar giant is evocative of the entire U.S. Army's efforts to defeat terrorism as the regime in itself. It's also likely the story came about as a coping mechanism to deal with the uncertainties and the losses accrued during the war. In a sense, Dan represents the friends that American soldiers have lost in 9/11 and the entire war that's followed. By combining the shadowy regime of terrorism within the confines of a giant, albeit supernatural entity, but still a singular figure, the soldiers have created a palpable enemy. As the story progresses, the soldiers defeat the enemy and save the day. Just like the story doesn't have a happy ending in the sense that the original casualties in the disappearing patrol were not mentioned or retrieved, so does the American War on Terror not have a clear end in sight. The triggering event shook the whole world and possibly entirely removed the notion that one country could become a veritable superpower that cannot be contested. Additionally, just like 9/11 left a deep mark on the world's collective memory, it's safe to say that the events featured in the story of the Giant of Kandahar entered the collective memory of the soldiers. This is best evidenced in the notion that the story was an open secret, with the second interview mentioning that it was known among the soldiers years after it was officially initiated. In fact, the story of the Giant of Kandahar is not the only such myth to arise within the confines of modern warfare. According to author Nick Orton, the U.S. soldiers would frequently encounter supernatural events, whether in the form of UFOs, ghosts, or cryptids like the Giant. He's written down some of those accounts in his collection, Tales from the Grid Square. In one instance, a soldier observed a massive heat signature in the distance through his thermal scope. While this could have been explained by a group of fighters huddled together around a fire, the soldier claimed that the signature got up and moved in unison. According to him, the creature, later dubbed the Giant of Kunar, was around 12 to 15 feet tall. In another story, an Air Force operator noticed 3 giants tending to a herd of sheep up in the mountains. According to his account, he could discern the giant's height by the ruler tool on his crosshair, which suggested the beings to be roughly 12 feet tall. Again, the similarities between the accounts are relatively clear, especially regarding the apparent size and stature of the giants. While all the stories have a similar air of fiction, it's highly possible that they were influenced by the same originator, which is likely the story of the Kandahar giant. As we mentioned previously, even if it is mythologically significant and analogous to the American War on Terror, the Kandahar giant is a relatively simple rendition of the classical myth of David and Goliath. Just like the original story resonates with the audience by its narrative of suffering, surprise, and overcoming adverse odds, so does the myth of the Kandahar giant represent the soldiers' firm belief that they would be able to end the war in their favor. Unlike the story, where the conclusion is relatively vague, the war in Afghanistan unofficially ended in 2021. However, real-life endings don't often have the same impact as myths. The Taliban rapidly assaulted the native forces present in the country, causing NATO troops to withdraw from Afghanistan entirely. This left the Afghan government, which was heavily dependent on foreign aid for function and defense alike, with minimal protection against future incursions. In effect, the Taliban regained control over most of the country's territory and overthrew the republic in favor of restoring the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The emirate is now ranked 180th out of the 191 territories in the Human Development Index, showing that the territory is among the most troubled in the world. With that kind of unsavory ending to this story, the potential of myths to inspire and provide emotional and psychological relief undoubtedly creates a new spectrum of human experiences to strive toward. The shared narrative of the Kandahar giant is more of a positive outlook on the realities of the war for U.S. soldiers, especially considering that the myth began in the second year of what would end up being a 20-year campaign, rife with strategic mistakes that ended with the U.S. unceremoniously leaving the country with its tail between its legs after spending close to $2.3 trillion funding the war effort, and the interim government that ultimately failed to take hold. However, it's essential to understand that the myth of the Giant of Kandahar remains just a story told by soldiers to make their days pass by faster. While comparisons to the events surrounding them can provide some insight into the emotional turmoil of war, it's essential to acknowledge the sacrifices those soldiers involved made. Most importantly, it always pays to stick more to the facts as the basis for decision-making and belief systems. Now check out Mongolian death worm. This is why you never want to come across it. Or watch this instead.